The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the boardroom, where Julian sat in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight against the walls. Across the mahogany table sat Marcus, a man whose entire career had been built on the art of the verbal ambush and the calculated humiliation of his peers. Marcus leaned forward with a predatory grin as he tossed a thick folder onto the table, which slid across the polished wood like a challenge and stopped inches from Julian's hand. "You've always been the quiet one, Julian, but there's a fine line between being a thinker and being a coward who simply has nothing of value to contribute to this firm." The words were designed to be a jagged hook meant to snag Julian's pride and pull him into a defensive explanation that would only confirm Marcus's dominance over the room. The other executives shifted in their leather chairs as their eyes darted between the two men because they were waiting for the familiar explosion of a corporate ego under attack. But Julian did not move a single muscle in his face, nor did his breath hitch as he simply looked at Marcus with a gaze that was as clear and as empty as a desert horizon. He didn't blink, and he didn't reach for the folder, because he knew that the moment he touched that paper, he was accepting the terms of a game he never agreed to play. Marcus felt the first flicker of irritation in the back of his throat, so he cleared it loudly and tapped his gold ring against the table in a rhythmic, distracting pattern. "I'm talking to you, Julian, and I expect that even someone with your limited capacity for leadership understands that silence in this room is synonymous with an admission of failure." Still, Julian remained a statue of absolute composure as he watched Marcus's pupils dilate with the realization that his carefully crafted insult had landed in a void. This is the moment where the power dynamic of a room shifts not through the strength of a voice, but through the terrifying vacuum created by a refusal to participate. Most people believe that to win an argument, you must have the last word, but they fail to realize that the person who doesn't need the word at all is the one who truly owns the space. Marcus's grin began to falter at the edges as he realized that the audience of executives was no longer looking at Julian's weakness, but were now staring at Marcus's growing desperation. He leaned closer until the scent of his expensive cologne filled the gap between them, and he lowered his voice to a hiss that was meant to be a final sharp blade. "If you don't answer me right now, I will make sure everyone in this building knows that you are nothing more than a ghost haunting a chair that could be filled by someone real." Julian slowly tilted his head just a fraction of an inch, as if he were observing a strange and slightly pathetic specimen under a microscope before he looked back at the rain outside. By looking away, he didn't just ignore the insult, but he effectively erased Marcus's presence from the reality of the room, which is the ultimate psychological execution. Marcus stood up so abruptly that his chair screeched against the marble floor, and he slammed his palms onto the mahogany table with a sound like a gunshot. "What the hell is wrong with you, Julian? Give me a response or get out of my sight before I lose my patience and show you exactly what happens to those who disrespect me." The silence that followed was even deeper than before, because now the room understood that Marcus was the one who had lost control of his emotions and his dignity. Julian finally looked back at him, and he didn't offer anger or even smugness, but instead he offered a look of mild, detached curiosity, as if he were waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. This is the secret of Machiavellian silence, which is the understanding that human beings are neurologically wired to seek feedback, and when they are denied it, they begin to unravel. When you react to someone, you are giving them a map of your mind and showing them exactly where your buttons are and how hard they need to press to make you dance. But when you remain a blank slate, they have nothing to hold on to, and their own momentum begins to throw them off balance until they are stumbling over their own words. Marcus began to pace the length of the boardroom as his face turned a mottled shade of red, and he started a rambling monologue about loyalty and the history of the company. He was talking to fill the silence, because the silence was a mirror that was reflecting his own insecurity back at him in a way he couldn't handle. The other board members began to look at their watches and exchange glances, because the man who usually commanded the room now looked like he was fighting a ghost and losing. Julian picked up a pen and began to take a slow, deliberate note on a pad of paper while Marcus watched him with wide eyes, wondering what secret judgment was being recorded. The truth was that Julian was simply writing down the time because he knew that in 10 minutes Marcus would have exhausted himself and the power would have fully transferred. This is the psychological mirror break, where the provocateur expects to see their influence reflected in your eyes, but finds only a cold and impenetrable surface. Most of us spend our lives being puppets to the opinions of others and jumping every time someone pulls the string of an insult or the cord of a criticism. But the master of dark psychology knows that the strings only work if there is tension, and if you refuse to pull back, the entire mechanism of control falls limp and useless. Marcus finally stopped pacing, and he stood in the corner of the room, breathing heavily, while he looked at Julian with a mixture of hatred and genuine confusion. He had spent 20 years breaking people with his words, but he had never encountered a man who could defend himself without saying a single syllable. Julian finally closed his notebook, and he stood up with a grace that made the rest of the room feel small, and he adjusted his tie with a slow and steady hand. He didn't look at Marcus as he walked toward the door, and he didn't offer a parting shot, because he knew that any word he spoke now would only give Marcus a chance to recover. The silence of the room followed Julian out into the hallway, and he could hear the sound of his own footsteps, echoing against the stone walls with a rhythm of absolute certainty. Back in the boardroom, Marcus sat down in his chair, and he looked at the folder he had thrown earlier, which now looked like a desperate and failed attempt at relevance. He realized that in the eyes of everyone present, he was no longer the alpha, but was instead the man who had screamed at his shadow and been defeated by it. This is the essence of status ambiguity, because Julian never claimed he was superior, but his behavior forced everyone else to assume it was true. When you refuse to explain yourself, you are signaling that you do not require the validation of the person questioning you, and that is the highest form of social power. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine, and it expects a reaction to every action, so when you break that pattern, you create a psychological glitch in the other person. They start to ask themselves if they have made a mistake, or if you know something they don't, and that seed of doubt grows into a forest of anxiety. Julian walked into his own office, and he sat down behind his desk, and he felt the immense calm of someone who has protected their internal peace against an invading force. He knew that by tomorrow, Marcus would be trying to apologize or find a way to make peace, because Marcus couldn't stand the uncertainty of Julian's silence. This is the invisible wall that protects your psyche, and it is built not of bricks and mortar, but of the sheer refusal to be moved by external pressure. If you can learn to sit in a room while someone insults you and feel nothing but a sense of observation, you have become truly dangerous to those who seek to manipulate. Most people are loud because they are afraid that if they stop making noise, they will be forgotten. But the silent person knows that they are unforgettable because they are a mystery. Machiavelli understood that the prince must be both a lion and a fox, but he also knew that the fox wins by knowing when to disappear into the tall grass of the mind. The world is full of people who want to bait you into a fight because they are bored with their own lives and they need your reaction to feel like they exist. But you are not an actor in their play, and you are not a character in their drama, unless you choose to pick up the script and read the lines they've written for you. Julian looked at his phone and saw 3 missed calls from Marcus, but he didn't feel the need to check the messages or even to delete them from his log. He let the phone sit there as a reminder that he was the one who owned his time and his attention, and no one could take it without his express permission. In the coming weeks, the office environment began to change as people noticed that Julian was no longer the target of Marcus's jokes or his aggressive outbursts. The bully had moved on to easier prey because there is no satisfaction in hitting a target that doesn't bruise and doesn't cry out in pain. This is the concept of provocation exposure, where the person trying to hurt you ends up looking like the one with the whack. problem in front of the entire world. By not defending himself, Julian had allowed Marcus to hang himself with the rope of his own ego, and the evidence was plain for everyone to see. We often think that we need to fight for our reputation, but the strongest reputation is built on the fact that you are unshakable and cannot be bribed by praise or broken by blame. True authority doesn't need to shout, because the sun doesn't need to tell you it's hot, and the ocean doesn't need to prove it is deep. When you master your emotional responses, you become the master of every room you enter, because you are the only one who isn't being pushed by the wind of opinion. The silence reversal is the final stage of this process, where the victim becomes the observer and the aggressor becomes the desperate seeker of a response. Julian eventually met Marcus in the break room a month later, and Marcus looked tired, and his eyes were darting around as if he were looking for a way to start a conversation. Marcus cleared his throat and said that he hoped there were no hard feelings about the boardroom meeting, and that he was just under a lot of stress at the time. Julian smiled a small, polite, and entirely empty smile, and he nodded once before he turned back to his coffee and let the silence return to the small room. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, waiting for Julian to say it was okay or to offer a platitude, but Julian just stirred his drink with a slow and rhythmic motion. The silence was so thick that Marcus eventually turned and practically ran out of the room, because he couldn't handle the lack of closure that Julian was providing. This is the ultimate victory in dark psychology, which is not the destruction of the enemy, but the total and absolute removal of their power over your life. You don't need to be mean, and you don't need to be cruel, but you do need to be indifferent, because indifference is the most powerful weapon in the human arsenal. If you can look at a manipulator and see them as a broken machine trying to find a part that fits, you will never be tempted to give them what they want. The story of Julian and Marcus is the story of every one of us who has ever felt pressured to speak when we wanted to remain still, and to fight when we wanted to walk away. It is a reminder that your energy is a currency, and you should be very careful about who you spend it on, because some people will never have enough to pay you back. The art of ignoring someone until they lose control is not about being a bad person, but about being a person who respects their own mental health more than a bully's ego. Machiavelli believed that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But he also knew that the most feared man is the one who cannot be understood. When you are silent, you are an enigma. An enigma is a threat to anyone who relies on predicting the behavior of others to stay in control. The rain finally stopped outside Julian's window, and the sun began to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the floor of his quiet and peaceful office. He realized that the true power he had gained was not the promotion or the respect of the board, but the realization that he was the king of his own inner world. No matter what Marcus said or what anyone else thought, the fortress of his mind was secure, and the gates were only open for those he deemed worthy. We are all under constant psychological siege by the world around us, and the only way to win the war is to realize that the battle is only happening if you participate. The next time someone tries to pull you into their chaos, remember the story of Julian, and remember that silence is the only answer that cannot be used against you. It takes a massive amount of courage to stay quiet when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to defend yourself and to prove that you are right. But the person who is truly right doesn't need to prove it, because the truth is a lion that can defend itself and doesn't need your help to bite. Let the world scream and let the manipulators dance while you remain the calm center of the storm, and watch as they eventually tire themselves out and fall. The power of silence is the power of the soul, and it is the only thing that will keep you sane in a world that is obsessed with noise and empty words. You are the architect of your own silence, and you have the right to build it as high and as thick as you need to protect the person you are becoming. The lessons of the dark psychology of silence are ancient, but they are more relevant today than they have ever been in the history of human interaction. We must learn to be comfortable with the void and to find strength in the absence of noise, because that is where the true self resides and grows. Julian eventually retired from the firm with a legacy of being the most respected and the most mysterious leader they had ever had in their long history. Marcus was long gone, having burnt out in a blaze of public outbursts and failed power plays that left him with nothing but a bitter memory of a man he couldn't break. The story ends not with a shout, but with a quiet nod to the power of the mind and the incredible strength that is found in the simple act of doing nothing. If you want to master the hidden architecture of the mind and learn the strategies that the world's most powerful people use to stay in control, then subscribe to Deep Mind Portal.